This program is made possible by a grant from the Lannan Foundation. The Howard County Poetry and Literature Society presents The Writing Life. Poet Henry Taylor talks with Mona Van Duyn, National Poet Laureate.
Hello, I'm Henry Taylor, and it's my good fortune today to be talking with one of my favorite poets, someone whose work I've known for 30 years or more, who is now the Poet Laureate, Poetry Consultant at the Library of Congress. She is also the recipient of a number of major awards, including the National Book Award and the Bollingen Prize, and most recently, the Pulitzer Prize for Near Changes. And it's a lot of fun to finally be able to sit down here in bright light and say, this is wonderful work. I love it very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Henry. We don't see each other nearly often enough. I'm sorry we're under such bright lights.
Well, we live too far apart. You've been in St. Louis for a long time. You taught at Washington University.
No.
At all, ever?
Well, not really. I was never a member of the English department.
I see. Uh-huh.
I taught for many, many years in the night school, night education classes.
Right.
While my husband taught in the English department.
Jarvis Thurston, yeah. And you and he, it was not there, I think, that you two founded that magazine, Perspective.
No, that was at the University of Louisville, where we both did teach in the English department. Or, as they say, Louisville.
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 Yes, Louisville. For viewers not close enough to Kentucky, that's Louisville, as in Louisville, Kentucky. One of the things I've always liked about your work is it's different from a lot of work that we find everywhere today in many, many ways. One of the ways that it seems to me to be particularly different is that you seem not to have committed yourself either to constantly writing metrically or to constantly writing unmetrically. And a whole lot of poets of our time have made that kind of a commitment. I haven't either, as it happens. Maybe that's why I approve of it so much. But
well, what you say is absolutely true, and it happened not by theory, but by pure accident, because I began writing poetry secretly as, I will say, a child, and poetry was not taught, but there were some poems in our anthologies in this tiny town I grew up in. And I had nursery rhymes, and most of the poems were rhymed in those days.
Sure.
I am not a young person. And I decided to become a poet very young. And I wrote secret notebooks full of poems, showing them neither to teachers, nor to parents, nor to friends. And I thought, you know, this is wonderful stuff. This, of course, is formal.
Sure.
As it was in those days. Then there were no modern books in that library, so it was not until I got to college that I discovered free verse, or non-formal verse, Sandberg and
Eliot, I
H.D.
suppose.
and not yet. That was graduate school.
Oh, okay.
This was a very conservative college. I found, in other words, the first wave of free verse in America, and I thought, this is wonderful, I want to do that. So I did that, but I couldn't give up the other. I loved it. And, well, to make a long story short, I've never been able to give up either one. And during the long Is my answer too long, Henry?
Not at all. No.
During the long domination of free verse, in which it was positively immoral to write a rhymed and metered poem, let alone use one of the standard forms, I kept on with this, with using both, depending on what I thought the poem I wanted to write demanded. And my anecdote, I really didn't feel as if I were a rebel, except at one point in which I read a critic reviewing somebody who said in horror, or who wrote in horror, how could anyone, how could any decent poet write a, well, now I've forgotten the name of the form.
A villanelle or something like that?
No, it wasn't a villanelle.
Sestina?
A sestina. How could any decent poet write a sestina in this day and age?
Well, critics
because
will say
the
most anything.
age is so chaotic and so on, you know, and poetry form must imitate one's sense of the world. The form has to imitate the sense. So, having read that, I sat down and wrote the first sestina of my life.
Sure, sure.
And published it.
Yeah. David Wagoner.
But I really have not been a rebel. I've been true to my sense of what the poem wanted to be.
Sure. But sometimes a certain little tiny jolt of rebellion has to contribute a little bit to what you think the poem wants to be. I mean, when you said that you reacted to this critical statement by just going out and doing a sestina, I'm reminded of David Wagoner's seeing somewhere a critical remark about Eleanor Wiley's poem Red Shoes. The sentence appears in it, if the poem had begun, let us put on appropriate galoshes, there could of course have been no poem. And so Wagoner writes a poem which begins, let us put on appropriate galoshes, and of course it's quite charming about two people who love each other going out and walking around in the snow and the mud and having a wonderful time. And we keep, I think it's a natural tendency to react that way to people who want to lay it down in a kind of unsmiling, humorless way that there are certain things you just can't do. Doesn't it make you want to see if that's so?
Well, since I was doing what you can't do all the time, and going around giving readings, after the reading, some scowling and upset professor or poet or whatever would come up to me and say, how can you do this? It's immoral.
That's amazing. That's amazing. The thought police really had a grip on us there for a while, or tried to. They tried to. It went into even into the schools. I have had colleagues who taught poetry writing who forbade metrical writing in their classes, and I thought that was sort of totalitarian. It is true, maybe, that that writing rhymed and metered verse requires something of the poet that isn't required of the free verse poet. I don't know exactly what it is. I'm not fond of saying that one is easier to write than the other. I think a good poem is hard to write no matter how you do it. But something about the quality of the attention or the nature of the attention you must pay to what you're doing, doesn't it shift depending on which of those two things you're doing?
Very definitely. And from my point of view, from my way of writing, from my experience, I can leave a free verse poem and go and cook a meal and come back and pick it up. The intensity of attention to let the form bring out of what you never knew you thought or felt let language work its will requires so intense attention that it's almost out of body. You feel almost out of body.
Sure.
You're so concentrated. And any break in that is a really bad break.
Yes, yes, I would agree. One of the things that, speaking of little tiny formal pressures, one of the things you've done that interests me a lot is taking the basic form of the sonnet, which is 14 lines of usually iambic pentameter, rhymed in any number of ways. Usually there are 2 or 3 standard ways of rhyming them, but you've written a number of poems which shorten the line and keep it everything else.
Sonnets are so easy.
Well,
and I wanted to make it harder and more fun. I wanted that intense concentration, the sense of the writer. Now, for the reader, they're probably too short. They fly by when read aloud, certainly. They fly by without the readers being able to get into them, you know.
I don't know that they necessarily escape us, though. When you do sometimes lengthen them by a few lines. In other words, although you cut out a bunch of syllables, they're still shorter than sonnets are, but you put in 4 more lines, so the total number of lines is 18. You have maybe 2 4-line stanzas and 2 3-line stanzas for a standard sonnet, and you just add another 4-line stanza or something like that. Could you read maybe?
It's a new form. Well, it's a form that is a pleasure for me to work with. I haven't done it very often, but I call it an extended minimalist sonnet.
Extended minimalist sonnet. It sounds
contradiction, total contradiction.
Yeah. But it has a nice sort of heft as a term, so that you could say it to the. It's dangerous. It's dangerous to use language like that around certain kinds of people. You know, they'll take you seriously completely. I wonder if you could read Mr. and Mrs. Jack Spratt.
Yes.
I think it's under here. Yeah. It's one of a recent example of the form.
I was told by Monroe Spears, a Southern critic, that this is one of his favorite love poems, and I actually hadn't thought of it as a love poem, but he's a better critic than I am, so it's a love poem. It's about my husband and me, obviously, cooking spaghetti together. Mr. and Mrs. Jack Spratt in the kitchen. About half a box, I say, and the male weighs his pasta sticks on our postal scale. To support my sauce of a guesswork rhymer, he boils by the laws of electric timer. Our joint creation, my searchings, revisions, tossed with his ration of compulsive precisions, so mimics life, we believe it mandated that God had a wife who collaborated. And cracked, scraped, old, still the bowl glows gold.
I think that's lovely. And I don't think it's just because my parents were the exact opposite of that. My mother always cooked with a spatula as well as with the measuring spoons. A level teaspoon was a level teaspoon.
Leveled off.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
And my father would sort of like that. And you couldn't really tell much difference. One of the things that struck me as you were reading that poem and your statement that you hadn't thought of it as a love poem is that maybe you write a lot of poems that you don't think are love poems, but I certainly do.
Well, it's a poem about marriage, and the golden bowl at the end should evoke for some people the extra pleasure of remembering James's novel, The Golden Bowl, which is about marriage.
Yeah. But
but it can just be the spaghetti bowl.
Yeah.
Which it is.
And it can be that, and if you don't make the leap to the Henry James connection, you haven't missed a great deal.
No.
It's not a problem. That's the way allusions and the like ought to work in poems, I think. The poem needs to be able to stand on its own ground, and I think yours do. If you write a poem that seems at first to be about being afraid of flying or whatever it is, it'll sit there if it's good enough and wait for you to think, oh yeah, and make those connections. And if you don't, I'll find that other one. I think there is one in here about attitudes toward flight. Could we read that? Views, yeah.
I have to say that I have long since lost this fear of flying.
I should hope so.
But I did have an uneasiness about it for a long time. I never was phobic. But people who are nervous as they wait to get on the plane, and even on the plane, I have some truly kooky gimmicks for allaying the nervousness, which they keep secret. I found this out since I've been reading this poem around the country over the years. But I had a truly kooky one. I mean, people know they're irrational, etc. And I once confided this to another poet, and to my astonishment, he had the identical one, only in reverse. And I do not announce which poet is which poet, because, except for the fact that everybody knows how kooky they are, they're very psychologically revealing, so I don't tell which.
Sure, yeah.
Views. First poet. I fly all the time, and still I'm afraid to fly. I need to keep both feet on the ground, the earth within reach of my eyes. In airports, I comfort myself by assessing others. Look at that handsome necktie, the weave of that suit, the portfolio. People of worth are going to be on this plane. The pearls on that shelf of expensive bosom, the hairdresser's art. All this tells my shuddering spirit that God wouldn't tip my seatmates, all these important people, from sight. Once the stewardess passed the word that Liz would be joined in Rome by Richard Burton, who was up in first class. I have never felt so safe on a flight. Second poet. I too fly all the time, and still I tremble. I arrive too early and sit there sweating and cold. I read at a book but can't make out what it means. I look around at the others as they assemble and make a collection of the dowdy old, backpacking young, slouched in their dusty jeans, men who have business suits of the wrong size on, frizzled hair, greasy hair, and drooping hem. Humbly they live, and humbly they will die, the scroungiest bunch of people I've ever laid eyes on. Surely God has no special fate in mind for them, I tell myself, like a plane falling out of the sky.
Well, I don't know that you have
And
to.
you know, people come up to me after they have heard this poem read in different parts of the country and confess to me as to a priest with enormous relief that they too have some crazy gimmick. And I must just tell you, Henry, there are only 4 or 5 of them in the world.
Gimmicks, you mean? Oh, sure.
And they have never confided to anybody else what
but there's a limited number of them.
Yes, tremendous repetition.
My friend George Garrett was sitting on an airplane one day when the conviction came over him that this plane was not going to make it. He was wrong, as it turned out, but he turned to he was next to the window, and he turned to the person sitting next to him and said, "I beg your pardon, I've lost my magic, and I have to get off this plane." And I've often wondered what it must be like to have been left on that plane, pondering what he could possibly have meant by that, "I've lost my magic."
Yes.
One of the poems that I haven't marked, actually, so I'm going to have to look for it briefly. And
Well, tell me its name so I can get ready to.
It's the Villanelle, about the people who are no longer here. And I can't remember whether it's in this book or the other book.
Condemned Site.
Yes, that's right, Condemned Site. I think there's time
it's in near changes.
to do that, yeah. And it's a poem.
I don't know whether I can, well, I guess we talk.
A villanelle.
Talk, Henry, say something.
Well, a villanelle is a terribly difficult form, it seems to me, because you have these two lines to which you are committed to very regular repetition. They come up as lines 3, 6, 9, 12, and then they come together at the end of the poem as a couplet, and yet you make it sound so natural. I wonder if you could read that one to us.
Not terribly natural. One really can't.
Well, poetry is...
Well, Elizabeth Bishop
in the context of poetry. I mean, I have another theory about that we go around claiming we want to use the language of real speech, but none of us would really be caught dead doing that.
Well, I wrote about dead friends. And the fact that my list of names are all men does not mean this is an AIDS poem,
right.
Actually. People have asked me that.
Yeah.
Because these men have died of different things. They were all friends. And I thought if I wrote it in this artificial form, that I might contain the... I wouldn't get too sentimental
right.
about it. Condemned Site, S-I-T-E. Peter, Tom, David, Jim, and Howard are gone. Down hallways in long-kept rooms, 4 others are in danger. In love's old boarding house, the shades of 5 rooms are drawn. At table, their places are set, their tea time kettle is on. No space has been aired and emptied for the needy stranger, though Peter, Tom, David, Jim, and Howard are gone. No one answers the ring of phone, the knocks from dusk to dawn, of sorrow's cost accountant, the would-be rearranger of love's old boarding house. The shades of 5 rooms are drawn on the heart's unlicensed embalming. Soon, fenced from the lawn, only the watching world, privacy's dog in the manger, can say Peter, Tom, David, Jim, and Howard are gone. And even the world, turning, will glimpse them alive in a spawn of unchanging images they tore from time, the changer. In love's old boarding house, the shades of 5 rooms are drawn, but those rooms are bright and warm. 4 other guests are in danger. In love's old boarding house, the shades of 5 rooms are drawn as if Peter, Tom, David, Jim, and Howard were gone. A house of shades is crumpled by life, the great stock exchanger.
And that one I described the form as taking the refrain lines alternatively down through the poem and then coming together as a couplet, but you move them apart in that one. You make a little variation on the form. You've always felt very free to do that, and I've always...
Actually, I follow the form, and I can't remember whose book I followed it exactly.
You found an example of that.
Yeah. And the Howard is not Howard Nimrod. My next book, of course, I have some
poems
about the loss of Howard Nimrod. This is another Howard who was a poet.
Well, one of the things that matters to me about that poem is its ability to confront those absences and the presence that the names continue to evoke. It's one of the things that seems to me to be under the fact that it is a villanelle, that the people stay there. And I thank you for reading it, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for joining us again today on The Writing Life.
Mona Van Duyn's books are Near Changes, If It Be Not I, Collected Poems, and Firefall. All are published by Alfred A. Knopf.